What if I told you that the Metal Gear Solid franchise, and in fact none of the Metal Gear games at all, were ever really supposed to exist? The Metal Gear franchise is an extremely popular and beloved series of stealth games that originated in Japan and materialized largely from the mind of series creator Hideo Kojima. Though these games were produced by Konami, in recent years after a fairly public falling out period between Kojima and Konami's multi-year-long pivot away from gaming, along with the release of Metal Gear Survive, Konami isn't often seen in the best light. While this falling out has been analyzed in depth by others, and it's something that we may eventually take a look at on this channel, the focus of today's video is going to be the circumstances that led to the creation of the Metal Gear series, a series that fans are actually lucky ever turned out the way it did and are lucky exists at all. The sources I use in today's video will be listed in the video description below as usual, so that you can read more if you are interested. I also want to add that any names that I pronounce, I say to the best of my ability with no disrespect meant to anyone, and that what the Metal Gear series would become over the course of its many titles is much bigger than any one creator, with heavy contributions from many different series veterans and writers like Tomokazu Fukushima and Shuyo Murata. I am planning a video in the future talking about what will happen to this series, my thoughts on if it can exist or not without Hideo Kojima, and my thoughts on those who did heavily contribute other than Kojima and more, but the history of Kojima plays a heavy role in the series of strange events that led to the creation of Metal Gear. Now, don't mistake this focus for a belief that this series is a one-man show. I truly do believe that there are a lot of misconceptions around the series, and that the massive team efforts that created each game are often unrecognized, but that's also a story for another day, and something we will touch on later in the video. This is one of my first Metal Gear videos I've made, and I want to make more, so if you enjoy this, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and even commenting and letting me know what you think. Your support means a lot to me, and I do love to hear your feedback. Before Hideo Kojima ever worked on Metal Gear Solid, he actually longed to be a movie director, as many people know in the gaming community. And as revealed in a 2012 interview with The Guardian, he would spend much of his time as a child watching movies with his family. My parents introduced a family tradition. Every night, we would all watch a film together, he said. I wasn't allowed to go to bed until the film had finished, the opposite of how it is for most children. My parents were huge fans of westerns, European cinema, and horror in particular. He went on to talk about how at the age of 10, his parents would actually give him money to go to the cinema by himself. I was allowed to go on the condition that I came home and discussed the movie with them afterwards. I had to buy the film brochure and bring it back with me. Then we would talk about the movie's themes and direction and what I felt. To Hideo Kojima's family, his understanding of art and his understanding of his own emotions and the responses to these films that he had, they were very important things and a family bonding experience. When he was 13 years old, his father would sadly pass away, which he said was hard and lonely, but strengthened my resolve to become a filmmaker. Unfortunately for Kojima, there were no film schools in Japan near where he lived, and the budgets for films at the time in Japan were relatively low, which actually led him to believe that he wouldn't really be able to make the types of films and stories that he wanted to make, with the constraints that Japanese society had on entertainment at the time. With his dream of becoming a filmmaker remaining just that, a dream, he studied economics at a university before making the choice to join the video game industry. I had no friends that were interested in cinema, nobody to encourage me in that career, he said. It was around that time that I saw Nintendo's Famicom for the first time. Immediately it struck me that this might be another route into making film-like experiences. Despite his interest in gaming, only Kojima's mother actually encouraged him to follow this path though, and ironically, Kojima only ended up working for Konami because they were the only video game company listed on the stock exchange at the time. He was actually disappointed by the response that his friends and others gave him to his choice of career, which was mostly seen as negative and unimportant. So he actually picked Konami in a way to kind of prove them wrong because of its status as being on the exchange. I guess it was a status thing, he said, but I thought working for a company like that might help people to view my vocation in a more positive light. To recap where we're at already and the odd series of events that led us here, not only was Kojima not originally interested in creating games, he wanted to make movies, but before entering the gaming sphere he was on the path of becoming an economist. That understanding of economy also led to his understanding of the stock exchange and the status that came with a Japanese gaming company being listed on it, which then led to his choice of working at Konami. Kojima had also joined Konami at a unique time in the video game industry, and I believe that his words will describe the time the best. There were many people joining the industry at that time who wanted to make films, to be directors, or to write comic books, but for whatever reason they hadn't been able to make it. The industry was full of dropouts, people who felt like games offered them another chance. I met many people in that same situation. We bonded together through that in some sense, but there wasn't a negative spirit with it at all. At Konami, there was this feeling amongst us all that games were somehow important to the future. We believed in the future of the medium, and that drove us to create the best possible work. The reason Kojima's story is so important to this point is because, even though there are so many others that are responsible for what Metal Gear would become over the years, Kojima was directly responsible for the creation of the series itself, especially the original Metal Gear game on the MSX2, which he only ended up on because of another of his projects at the company, Lost World, being cancelled after 6 months. Konami had directed him to make a war game in order to sell copies for the MSX, but Kojima didn't really want to make the same type of game as everyone else. He complied with their request, but he had been placed within the MSX division of the company, though he had originally thought he would be making arcade or Famicom games. After being placed as pretty much the head of this military-oriented project, he found that the team that had been working on a military MSX project was having a hard time actually getting the MSX to render multiple soldiers on screen at once, and also having issues with the system actually showing very many bullets on the screen, which made it very difficult to make any sort of action shooter game. Kojima would tell MSX Magazine, "Back then I think you could only move in 6 directions. 6 directions was going to be impossible, but even reducing it to just 4 was too restricting. We had no choice but to make a game that could be done without enemies, and that's what allowed me to develop Metal Gear." While speaking with the PlayStation blog in 2012, Kojima actually touched more on the origins of the series and the ideas behind it. The MSX had many technical limitations, and I didn't want to make war games, he said. So I decided to create something similar to The Great Escape, something involving an escape, and in the end I created an espionage game. The game was also inspired by the simplest of ideas, the game of hide and seek.
今の子供はあまりやってないと思うんですけども、非常にこう友達と役割分担する、ことでですね、一転してこう逆転の立場になるんですよ。で、その辺の緊張感というのが非常に面白くて、今もそうですけど、子供とかくれんぼはよくやるんですけど、非常に好きな遊びですね。
As reported by Retro Video Game Magazine in their Celebrating Stealth issue, Kojima was actually inspired by other movies of the day as well, including Terminator and the spy themes of the 007 movies, which actually pushed the creation of Solid Snake and the game's concepts more towards a stealth espionage setting and away from the ideas of a prison escape. It took a lot of pushing behind the scenes to convince anyone at Konami, let alone the other developers on the project, that a game where you avoided enemies could even work and would be interesting. But it was done in the end, and the first Metal Gear game was released. Kojima would go on to make a sequel to Metal Gear, which was Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake on the MSX2. Now, Metal Gear 2 actually wouldn't have been made, at least in its current state with those ideas, if not for Konami's desire to capitalize off the first game. The NES port of Metal Gear, which is a very different game, and honestly considered inferior to a lot of people including Kojima, sold a ton of copies in the United States. Konami then commissioned a sequel specifically to the NES version of the game, which was titled Snake's Revenge, which wasn't really even the same type of game. It was more of an action game with very odd segments in it, and it just didn't really fit the series, but Kojima was not involved with this game, and he only ended up returning to make the proper Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake after meeting a developer on a train who had worked on Snake's Revenge and expressed interest in seeing a sequel from the original creator of the first game. Kojima then pitched this sequel idea to Konami, which he had thought up on the train ride home and over the course of the following night, and it was approved. And with the release of the PlayStation later on the horizon, 3D gaming was becoming much more mainstream and exciting for developers and players alike. When I heard there was going to be a home console capable of 3D polygon graphics, my first thought was, we can finally do a true hide-and-seek game, he said. We kept a bird's eye view so far out of reluctance, but I was curious if we were able to do stuff like hiding under desks or inside lockers, so we were going to make Metal Gear Solid with a simple setup. Metal Gear Solid would also be the beginning of a more cinematic approach to the series, as storylines were fleshed out, the world was added onto, and the movie inspirations of Hideo Kojima's past actually became much more apparent in the voice-acted game. I know there's a lot of debate when it comes to Kojima himself. Some want to give him all credit for the Metal Gear series, and that's just where it ends for them, while others think that he overcredits himself in his games. I personally think that he is very much responsible for the creation of this series and many of the ideas behind it, but it is clear that the Metal Gear franchise would not exist without him, no matter where you fall. He pitched the original game in a time where the concept was almost unheard of. Even though there were stealth games, they were few and far between, and he went on to present the ideas for a second game to Konami, and it actually worked. I wanted to make note of this here because there are so many talented creators who did work on the Metal Gear franchise who actually go unremembered by players. Kojima's often given all of that credit, and I want to definitely give him credit where it's absolutely due. The man has a lot of genius ideas, he was a video game developer, and he was very hands-on with his games. He wasn't just sitting back giving commands, he was also on the ground floor involved. But I also want to highlight the very innovative creators who helped bring these games to life along with him. Video games are always a team effort, but this is where the ideas behind the scenes of the Metal Gear series also started to not really just be Hideo Kojima. Up to this point, with Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, Kojima was the primary shot caller and storyteller, and while he would go on to be those things, his vision up to this point was pretty much exactly what appeared on the screen. With Metal Gear Solid 1, more staff members, such as the famed artist Yoji Shinkawa, who was not quite as famed at the time as he is now, would be entering Konami and helping to create unique characters that would become staples of the franchise going forward. This is important because yes, there were game designers and developers working with Kojima before, but they were mostly just enacting his vision. They were just kind of taking his will and putting it into the games. Nothing wrong with that, but Metal Gear Solid 1 started to kind of have other ideas clash against the ideas of Hideo Kojima and be adapted alongside of his ideas to create the games that we would go on to see. The tides were beginning to turn as more creative input for the games also came from other sources. Shinkawa designed many of the characters, for example, that we saw in the first Metal Gear Solid, and Shinkawa helped to actually create the atmosphere of the game itself. Without his art, the original game and its atmosphere and world building would have appeared much differently. Shinkawa would also go on to provide key art for basically all of the following main Metal Gear games, and his style is impeccable, and he's a legend in artistry. His beautiful designs and art would inspire and help create the environment's overall tone, like I said, and memorable elements of the games for decades to come. And it's actually hard to overstate how much Shinkawa's art helped contribute to the creation of what Metal Gear Solid 1 is, let alone the rest of the franchise. Another name that deserves more credit for Metal Gear Solid being what it is Yuji Korekido. Korekido helped actually work as a lead programmer on the Metal Gear Solid series. He worked on MGS1, but also the VR missions, MGS2, 3, the Twin Snakes, Portable Ops in a supervision role, and was the lead programmer for Metal Gear Solid 4, and was a big part of what made MGS5 and the Fox engine run so well. He's actually credited for even more than these things. I'm sure you could go on and look up a list of his accolades, including work on Peace Walker and even Metal Gear Survive, and I could probably make a whole video just talking about his work. But his skills actually helped create the Metal Gear Solid series as well that we see today, even though he did sometimes disagree with and push back against some of the ideas from series creator Hideo Kojima. These were actually two very intelligent creators that sometimes disagreed a bit on things, but they found a balance that reached an excellent level of quality in the final products they created. Even after realizing all the weird and bizarre twists of fate that allowed Metal Gear to exist and let alone become a series, the perfect people had to land in the perfect spots in the gaming industry, and Konami specifically, to work together in order to create what would become Metal Gear Solid. It's worth noting, with Metal Gear 1 being so popular in the West, there was a question of localization and translation for the PlayStation 1 game Metal Gear Solid, which obviously was a shoo-in for being popular in the West as well. How would the now story-heavy stealth game Metal Gear Solid 1 go to the West while preserving the vision of its creators from Japan? It's worth noting that, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, many localizations were not done very well. Enter Jeremy Blaustein. Jeremy's contributions to Metal Gear Solid are very debated in the fandom. Actually, bringing him up is a bit of a can of worms, because it's worth noting that he has gone on the record several times to talk about his experiences with translation, and anytime he does and anytime anyone else does, there's a lot of arguing that follows from people in comments on Reddit threads, etc., because he was actually hired by Konami as the primary translator of Metal Gear Solid 1 to change the game from Japanese to English. And fans really often debate whether or not Jeremy's translation is close enough to what Hideo Kojima's original script was. Like I said, he's gone on the record several times to talk about his experiences and viewpoints. Some of those interviews can actually be found on YouTube and on the internet in general, so there are some in the description down below with the sources, but it is a can of worms because people kind of turn it into an argument. I will say that I personally think his translation did help make the language of Metal Gear Solid more natural for Western audiences, and did contribute to, at the very least, establishing the world of Metal Gear Solid for English-speaking audiences, which would actually go on to be a massive source of income, support, and fandom for the Metal Gear series. I personally don't have any problems with his translation overall, or the translations of games that followed from other translators after him, but it's worth noting that this game would be remembered differently if it was translated differently. A good example of a game being remembered differently is actually a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes for the GameCube, which is often actually criticized for having corny dialogue, despite the fact that the game did actually adhere more to the original script that Kojima wrote. Now, that game is its own can of worms as well, because it also does have a lot of action scenes that are also debatedly added because of Kojima, but we're going to wait to get further into that. It's just a good example of how script translation can affect the perception of a final product, and overall I like that game too. There's so many more creators that actually went on to heavily contribute to this series, and who I do want to talk about more in a future video about whether or not this series can exist going forward without Kojima's involvement and still be good. But I did want to point to some of the early contributors that made Metal Gear Solid itself and the following series exist. This series was created due to a man who wanted to be something else entirely, seeing the potential beauty in gaming and deciding to try and elevate the craft into something more than it was, who arrived at Konami not because he cared about Konami the company, but because he wanted to prove people wrong who were mocking his choice of career, and pick something that was more financially established and had status behind it. Kojima landed at the company at the same time as many others were entering the gaming industry after having issues with other career paths, and these wayward souls would all kind of find each other at the same time perfectly to create one of the most interesting video game franchises of all time. The story of the Metal Gear franchise and Metal Gear Solid in general is a story of things that were not actually likely to happen. Games being pitched that were almost unheard of at the time, and really interesting circumstances that led to people ending up in each other's lives and at the same company at the right time in order to make something so amazing. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who watched this video. I really do want to make more Metal Gear videos going forward, and I do appreciate your support. I am a variety channel, so I make a lot of different types of content. YouTube itself is not a huge fan of that, but your support really does mean a lot to me, and if you enjoyed today's video and you have more ideas for videos in the future, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. I actually want to take a moment to thank my channel members here, because you're all awesome and make content like this possible, on a very interesting platform that does not really award actually trying new things anymore. So thank you very much to all of you. I hope you have a fantastic day. And as always, everyone, stay shui.